In the interest of being zero waste with my Edith smock, I thought I would make a belt out of the offcuts that were down the side. So here I have a pair of long rectangles. This measures 6 centimetres smaller than my actual waist measurement, and the width was determined by the remainder of the fabric that I had. I could make that wider or narrower depending on my preference and the amount of fabric. Next, I have the two fastening pieces. One is 30 centimetres and one is 20 centimetres, and they're cut as a pair as well. And for all pieces, I have interfaced them with a heavy woven interfacing to reinforce the belt. The width of the strap pieces is determined by my fastening, so I'm going to use square or rectangular D-rings. So I've drawn my seam allowance on here, and the finished width needs to be exactly the internal measurement of my D-rings, but you can use any size that you want. To start with, I'm going to sew around my fastening pieces. To do that, I'm just going to turn over the edges of the seam allowance at one end, sewing around and across the bottom and back up. Make sure you back tack at each end. So here it is, I've sewn it around. Now I'm going to fold over the seam allowance and finger press to get a really nice sharp corner at each end, like so, and then I'm just going to sort of start turning it through. The wider this is, the easier it is. I'm going to take my trusty knitting needle, and using the blunt end, I'm just going to push the tube back on itself, like so. Just making it nice and neat. And then a little trick, I then use the pointy end, first of all, to push through the corners, and I just slide along the actual seam allowance, which helps get those corners nice and crisp. The thicker you're interfacing, the trickier this is, so you might just need to spend a little bit of time working on it. When you're happy, just slide the point of the knitting needle along that seam allowance, and that's just going to kind of force out that edge. So see how that's already starting to sit nicely before I've even pressed it? And do the same on the other side. And I'm just going to make sure that's all nice and neat, and give that a press, and do this exactly the same to the other side. Here are my two fastening tabs, turned through and pressed. Next, I'm going to do the body of the belt. So if you fancied, you could do some embroidery on this, and there is a template for that, but in this case I'm going to just leave it plain. Now what you need to do is leave a portion to turn through, so you can draw your seam allowance on if you want, but what I like to do is leave an amount of about 8 to 10 centimetres in the middle. So I'm going to start sewing on either side of that line, and I'm going to sew all the way around the rectangle, finishing leaving an opening to turn the belt through. Trim your threads, and we're going to turn that through. If your fabric is very thick, you can miter the corners, but I prefer not to, because by actually leaving the seam allowance on the corners, I am reinforcing those corners and making them stronger, so they're less likely to bend when the belt is being worn, particularly when it's a little bit wider like this one. So I've tucked both my corners in, having folded them, and I'm going to use my trusty knitting needle, the blunt end, to push the tube through and out through that opening, and then I'm just going to use the pointy end to check that my corners are looking nice and sharp. So even with the interfacing, I just poked through the material there, which is not great, but it will recover, especially with a bit of an iron. So pulling that through, and the same on the other side, finger pressing my seam allowance over so the corners are nice and sharp, and then because it's wider I can just sort of tuck one of those corners in first and then do the other side and tuck the corner in, which just helps make those corners nice and sharp when I do turn it through. So pushing it back towards that little opening, pulling it through, just making sure the corners are nice and sharp. That. And then the same as with the strap portion, the sort of that I'm going to use for the fastenings, I like to just run the knitting needle along that seam allowance, and I just find it makes pressing so much easier because it just forces it out and makes it all really nice and crisp. So I'm going to give that a press. Now I'm going to sew that little opening closed. To do that, I've threaded a needle with a single thread. I'm going to come back in from the opening about 1 centimetre, and then I'm going to use a ladder stitch to sew the opening closed. So I'm going to slide the needle along the fold of the fabric, come straight across and slide along the fabric, and my spacing here is probably just shy of 1 centimetre, just coming along, and it's only a small opening so it's not going to take me very long, and I don't really need to even pull it tight as I go until I've done a few stitches. And then if I open that out, you can see what I mean about it being like a ladder, and then you can just give it a gentle pull and it closes it invisibly. It is such a great little technique. So coming along and coming to the end, so just going slightly past where the opening started, and I'm just going to really discreetly just over sew in place to secure that thread. And then it's a good idea just at that point to give it another press just to make sure that it's nice and flat. To sew the fastenings on, mark the center of the belt. So in this case this is 6 centimeters wide, so halfway is 3 centimeters. Then measure along each of your fastenings and just measure in about 2.5 centimeters. This is an arbitrary sort of measurement, you know, it's entirely up to you what you want to do. I just think that that looks nice. Then I'm going to position this tab so that the center of the tab lines up with the center of the belt, and my 2.5 marker is about 1 to 1.5 centimeters away from the edge, and you can pop a pin in if you want. Then I'm just going to sew around the tab in a kind of rectangular square. Tack at each end, and you might like to make the stitching size just a little bit smaller. So there you can see I've sewn on one tab, and I've used a friction marker to draw that marker in so that when I iron it, it will disappear. So let's do the other side. To attach your D-rings, or in my case my rectangular rings, I'm going to thread them through the short tab, and then I'm going to bring it over to match over the square or rectangle that I've already sewn. So I'm going to now sew that in place, and this is on the right side, I should have mentioned that the first one was sewn on the wrong side, and I'm just going to sew another rectangle in place. Snip your threads, and there it is on the right side, and on the wrong side it still looks pretty neat, but you know, if you go over a little bit, that's okay because it's on the inside. Next, we need to secure these D-rings. If you don't sew quite close to the edge of the D-rings, the belt risks coming undone. So I'm just going to, actually, I could use a zipper foot, but I'm actually just going to put my needle into the far position, and then I'm just going to put my foot as close to the D-rings as I sort of comfortably can without forcing it. I'm going to start sewing 1/2 centimetre in from the edge so that any threads I cut don't leave tails. Back tack towards the edge, come forward, and then back tack finishing away from the edge so that when I cut both my threads, they're kind of more towards the centre than the edge. And there we have it. So, all ready to be worn. You may also like to make your belt out of leather. Here I've made one, and it's quite wide because my buckle dictated the width of the belt, and I thought those proportions look quite good. Now I'm going to show you how to make one though out of this white leather, which in the interest of sustainability was harvested from a couch on the side of the road by Sue Stoney, and she gave me a piece of it, and I've just given that a clean. And this is the buckle I'm going to use for this one. So I have made the tying pieces proportional to the buckle so that they will fit in, and then I've made these so that they're just going to sit nicely within the frame of the main belt portion. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually sew around the leather. This leather is fairly thick and it cut really nicely, and that's okay, but you can see on this one I've actually stitched around the edge, and I think that that makes a nice feature. When you come to sew around the edges, when you're doing the main portion, start on a short edge because that will be covered by a fastening piece, and so that means any back tacking you do won't show. If you have a domestic sewing machine, you can use a leather needle or a size 16 needle, which would be good. My machine is a semi-industrial, so I don't have needle options as such, but I only have sized needles. So I've used a size 16 needle for this, and I've just done a test on a piece of leather to make sure it's sewing nicely, because sometimes it doesn't. My stitch length is quite big because it can stick a little bit, and when I back tack I just do a couple of stitches. I've actually rounded the edges of all of my leather pieces just because I think it looks nice. So that means that when I come to a corner, I put the needle down, pivot and sew an angle, and then carry on sewing. And you can see how neat that looks by just, doing that angled stitch on the corners. I'm using yellow thread as a contrast because I think with my smock it'll look really pretty, because the smock is yellow with white embroidery, so I'm making this white with yellow stitching. So I'm just going to do the same to the other two pieces. On the long strap we want to mark the holes for where it's going to thread through the buckle. So I've measured in 2 centimetres from the edge and then marked my spacing right along the centre, 2.5 centimetres apart, and then I'm just going to use this hole punch to make my holes. So you want to make sure that they really are centred, and punch. like so. And then on the short side, which is going to go over the buckle, now this measurement can vary a bit, so do check before you sew it on, but it's going to go over this middle bar, and this thing is going to come through. So what you need to do is actually just thread this over and over the bar, just sort of ignoring that for the minute, because you're going to have to be able to sew this down, and we will use some glue as well. But when I fold that over, I know that I'll be able to stitch along that line. So I could have made this longer if my belt buckle was bigger. So with this example, you can see the overlap had to be a lot more because the buckle itself was bigger and it wouldn't have fitted under the sewing machine. So when I sewed it, you can see just along the edge there. So I'm just going to fold that over and give myself like a little pull on there, and then I can mark the center like that. Take the buckle off and punch that hole, and just check. So which way does that go? It's that way up. So it comes up, it goes through, and that goes over, and then it's going to sit. Oh, actually I've done that upside down. Make sure you check all this first. So that goes that way up, so I want it to finish that way up. Over, poke it through and through, and there we go, that's the right way up. And then on the wrong side I can flip that over just so I can see that I've got enough room to sew it. So what we need to do now is take that off. I'm actually going to just halfway and pop some glue on there. I'm using this Tarzan grip. You can use any super strong glue that you like. I'm just going to unscrew the whole thing like that, and I'm just going to squeeze that on. This is a little bit dry from lack of use, so you don't want to use loads. Just pop that on like so, and then put the lid back on so it doesn't ooze everywhere. Sometimes it dries out a bit and you can just actually poke the end with a pin. Make sure you throw that pin away afterwards though. Okay, so I've got my glue on there. I'm just going to carefully tuck that through and pull my buckle so that it's sitting correctly. Just double check that. So, and press that. You could use some little dog clips and just hold that in place while the glue sets. Like that. And we'll wait for that glue to dry. My glue has dried, so now I'm just going to sew across that edge. So I'm going to rotate the buckle around, and to make sure that I can get it close enough, I'm going to move my needle position over, and I could also use a zipper foot. So it is pretty close, so I've got to be very careful to make sure that I get that buckle out of the way of the foot. Make sure you back tack at each end, but the glue will hold it secure. Take it out from the machine, trim your threads, and there you go, you've got a belt. So you can fasten that up, and how easy is that? You never have to buy a belt again. Let's try these on.